My name is Loy Schat, and I'm a special solution architect, part of the cloud management suite of services, and we're here to talk about Ansible and the Red Hat automation story. But before we get into that, just to reflect on the day a little bit. In the morning, we've heard kind of the keynote speech around Destinasia and bringing in all these products together. Containers, public clouds, middleware, JBoss, Fuse, and the list goes on and on and on. And that's only the Red Hat product suite of services. As a customer, you have Microsoft stacks, you have VMware, you have Azure, and the list goes on and on. The expectation is today as organizations and as operations is that we need to be able to deliver the same level of services that we were doing yesterday over 150 virtual machines. Now we've got 2,000 virtual machines, some of them running in public cloud, some of them running on-premise, and we need to be able to deliver this consistently across all these different environments. This is where automation really comes in. If there's a task that you need to do more than once, it should be automated. And this should be the motto of any organization today, for you to be able to utilize your time wisely, effectively, and to be able to do more with less. So, Red Hat and automation. Some of you have heard of Ansible, some of you haven't. We're going to talk today about Ansible and Ansible Tower. It's two different products that work together hand in hand that build the Red Hat automation story. So what is Ansible? Ansible is a basically open source project that started to give you the ability to easily describe your application into smaller bits and smaller components. And the other thing that we wanted to do with Ansible is that we wanted to make it simple. We wanted to be able to make it human readable. So essentially it's utilizing a language called YAML, and it's built into playbooks. We're going to show you an example of what YAML is and what playbooks are and how do they actually work together. So this is the open source community project that we have that is the code and the basis of automation when it comes into Red Hat. On top of that, we've built in Ansible Tower, which is the ability to take this beautiful automation work that we've done and extend it to the enterprise with a very rich UI and a RESTful API and a lot of fantastic feature sets as well that we're going to explore a little bit further that enables you to take this automation beyond the DevOps team or the infrastructure team by extending that across the whole organization. A few stats. I think this is important just to kind of set the context of how Ansible works. This has been true since the inception of Ansible. Ansible is being downloaded over 400,000 times a month, every month since its inception. That has very significant effects in terms of how Red Hat and how Ansible is actually working. We have thousands of users, hundreds of customers, and we have over 2,500 community contributors. It's grown to become one of the biggest open source communities that we have today. A lot of the innovation that we're seeing as part of Ansible is actually coming from the community directly. Hence the 950 plus Ansible modules. We will discuss in a lot more depth how Ansible works, but the 950 plus modules covers basically all the vendors and all the different technologies that you would like to automate on. I'm not talking about automating Red Hat technologies, I'm talking about automating your enterprise. Whether we're talking about applications, about infrastructure, around cloud, middleware, there are modules out there that support that and build on top of that. So, what is actually Ansible? It's three things. It's simple, it's powerful, and it's agentless. Let's start with agentless. For you to be able to automate and build a platform that is agnostic and independent of the managed services or the services that you want to automate on, you need to have the capability to reach all these different devices. I want to be able to automate on Linux virtual machines, on containers, on Windows machines, on network devices, on firewalls, and on load balancers. For me to be able to do this, I have to be agentless. There's no agents to exploit, there's no agents to update, and I can connect to anything that has a communication interface. We utilize OpenSSH to communicate with Linux-based devices and network-based devices, WinRM, Windows Remote Management, to connect and automate on top of Windows devices. And we also have a very rich API that we can deal directly with an API-based environment. A small example, some of the load balancers out there or DNS management tool sets, you can actually do that using the API enterprise. Why is it powerful? It's powerful because it is adaptable to your organization today. Ansible has various use cases. Some people use it for compliance, some people use it for provisioning, some people use it for configuration management, and some people use it for orchestration. Automation is essentially what your strategy as an organization, what you're trying to achieve. And due to the fact that Ansible is very powerful in terms of the breadth of services that it can automate on, it can really adapt to the use cases that you have within your organization. A lot of the automation tool sets that we have in the market today are built for developers. If you have a look at some of the tool sets that are built on Ruby, you need a developer to be able to develop on top of that. We wanted to change that with Ansible. I wanted to give you a file that if you're an infrastructure guy, if you're a network guy, or if you're a DevOps guy, you can understand what automation is doing and to be able to build on that. Hence, Ansible is built on YAML, human readable. We're going to show you an example of what that's like. It's very simple. It executes tasks in order, and it has the ability to extend that to multiple different teams. So, the Ansible way. There's a lot of things that I'm very passionate about Ansible, probably is showing already, but there's a lot of really important things that kind of define Ansible as a tool set and why it differentiates from others. The fact that it is agentless makes it cross-platform. I don't care where your infrastructure lies today. I don't care what you want to automate on, whether it's physical, whether it's virtual, whether it's container. And if that new technology comes on tomorrow, there is going to be a way for us to be able to automate on top of that. We discussed that it is human readable, and that is important in terms of extending a lot of this functionality to the enterprise in general. The playbook, I will show you an example later on, but it has the ability to break down these big monolithic applications or infrastructure or components within our enterprise into smaller, more manageable bits that are reusable. If I end up automating how we provision a VM on top of AWS, that becomes a standard set of automation toolset that I can extend to multiple different use cases within my organization. I don't have to rebuild that over and over and over again. We support the CI/CD and methodology. Everything is version controlled, whether you have a Git repository or Atlassian or Bitbucket in terms of managing your source code. Ansible works with those out of the box and integrates with that. And another powerful thing, I actually was asked this question earlier today is, oh yeah, but some people can go and provision things manually on top of AWS and Azure. How am I going to be able to detect this as long as I don't have an agent installed on it? And that's very simple. It's the concept of dynamic inventory. When I'm automating today on top of any provider, whether it's on premises like VMware, Hyper-V, OpenStack, or I'm doing this on public cloud, I'm utilizing dynamic inventories. Every single time I'm running an automation job, I'm running it on the latest and on the best information that I have from that provider directly. So when I'm automating on top of AWS, I'm invoking a dynamic inventory to get me the list of all the VMs that are existing today. The ones that have been decommissioned are removed from my inventory. The new ones that have been added have been discovered. And finally, automation is not something new. It's people that have been doing it in the organization, various different formats. So we know that we're never going to start in a greenfield approach when we talk to customers. Some people today are using Jenkins, some people are using Artifactory, some people are using Puppet, some people are using Salt or Chef. Whatever it is that you have from an automation perspective, we don't expect you to rip and replace. And that's the beautiful thing about Ansible. If there are gaps in terms of how you automate and how your environment runs, Ansible can fill that. So we talked about open source and how we develop applications and the fact that we're open source and everything is up to the community. But another thing that we don't talk about so much as Red Hat, which is one of the powerful things from our management perspective, is that we're agnostic to the vendor. When I come and start talking about automating on public cloud, on private cloud, on Windows, or on network, I need to be able to support everybody and everything. This gives you an example. If you have a look at the list behind me, the list is 95% non-Red Hat products. I can automate from a cloud perspective on top of AWS, Azure, OpenStack, Rackspace, Google, Dockers, Racks, and the list goes on and on. I think it was mentioned earlier in one of the talks, SQL on RHEL. That's not the beginning or the end of our relationship with Microsoft. We have over 75 different modules that helps you automate on top of Windows. Whether you're doing ACLs, whether you're adding users, building applications, domain controllers, IAS, PowerShell, DSC, we support all that from Ansible today. Another big pillar that we have seen Ansible grow significantly within the market is our network space. There's a lot of tool sets that are available today that automate on top of Cisco or Arista or Palo Alto or Juniper, and they're usually very, very specific to that tool set or that vendor. We wanted to change that. We wanted to give you the ability to say, I want to be able to automate the same way on top of a Cisco switch as I'm doing on top of an Arista switch. And hence the concept of Ansible, the concept of templates, where I can build in a template and I can push that configuration to multiple different vendors in the same consistent way. Quick thing around the network, I'm sure that some of you as customers are investigating or have already moved into software-defined networking. We have a fantastic story with working with some of the biggest vendors in the market when we talk about network service orchestration or TLF or Yang or ACI. We don't work in isolation. We work with these products as well. So if you are utilizing some of these technologies when it comes to software-defined networking, we can actually integrate and build on top of that. The idea is that we want to make Ansible the end-to-end automation platform, whether you're talking about network, infrastructure, cloud, or applications, we cover the whole stack. So, the last pillar, Notify. We know that we don't work in isolation. If we automate something, we want to be able to push it to ServiceNow to update the service ticket that's saying that there's a change that's been done. We want to email the help desk saying that these changes have been made. If you're cool and using Slack to notify your team members, we can actually push messages into Slack. We can even start automation from Slack if you're interested. I don't know if anybody want to really use that, but I heard a use case of somebody saying, I needed to run an automation job, so I logged onto Slack and I pushed the job from Ansible Tau. So multiple ways you can run automation within your organization. So, what does that mean? These modules essentially cover this. Whether we're talking about firewalls, load balancers, containers, public cloud, on-premise, we can orchestrate, we can configure, we can deploy, provision, and apply security compliance. Due to the fact that we are agentless and agnostic from a vendor perspective, you have the end-to-end coverage when you start talking about automation, which is a very unique thing when it comes to Red Hat and our Ansible story. There's a lot of fantastic tool sets in the market that automate very, very specific workloads and very, very specific environments. We wanted to get that same level of consistency and same level of reliability when it comes to automation, but we wanted to do that end-to-end. So this is a good example in terms of how we're doing things. Let's take a DevOps team that's trying to deploy a new application. And let's assume that we're not all cool or running 100% of our products on top of OpenShift, where you don't have to do anything and just push a button and you deploy the new application with no talk to anything. In reality, we know that there are monitoring tools, there's some load balancers, there's some services, there's some processes that need to be followed. Imagine I can only have a tool that can automate on top of my application itself. So stopping the monitoring, removing it from load balancing, and stopping the services before I deploy my automation toolset will require something to do that. Typically, in any organization, it's a manual process, or it's an operations guy that needs to go and do it after hours, then push a button to deploy an application on top of that. We wanted to change this. We wanted to show how you can do this end-to-end. With Ansible today, you can build in your playbook that goes in, stops the monitoring, remove the device that you want to upgrade or deploy the application outside of the pool, deploy the application, test it, make sure it works, join it back to the load balancer, join it back to the domain, do some some testing on top of that, and ensure that the application that's been deployed actually works. So this gives you the ability to really move away from collection of configurations into an ordered list in terms of how your infrastructure runs. We don't see it as isolated works of automation, but an end-to-end stepped approach in terms of how automation works today. So, Ansible. We talked a little bit about the capabilities of the product and how it actually works. What are the components? What is Ansible made of? I mentioned in the beginning that we're going to talk about Ansible and Ansible Tower. Ansible is made of these 4 components that you see in front of you now. It's inventory, it's modules, it's plugins, and it's an API. It's written in it's written in YAML. The tasks are executed sequentially, and you are invoking an Ansible module. So what does that mean? That means that every single playbook that I write has the same look and feel, whether I'm automating on top of a network device, on top of an application, on top of a middleware. And the only difference that I'm invoking is I'm invoking a different module. And this module is public cloud or network, etc. These modules are written in multiple languages based on the vendor that we are automating on top of. So if I am using AWS as a module to provision some VMs or create some PVCs or security groups on top of AWS, I'm invoking the AWS API directly. It is written in YAML, but in the backend I'm communicating with AWS using the AWS CLI. Same applies when I'm talking about Windows, it's PowerShell, or I'm talking to Linux, I'm running native commands on top of the operating system or the infrastructure that I'm trying to automate on top of. The concept of plugins, we know that no module can satisfy 100% of how you run your organization today. Plugins give you the ability to invoke third-party or concepts outside of the standard way of doing automation, where I'm gathering data from third-party devices, or I'm invoking a third-party inventory list to get a little bit more richer information before I push my automation toolset. Inventory. I discussed this briefly, the concept of dynamic inventory. We have two ways you can do this. If you're really, really good and you know environment inside out, we can use a static inventory to define what you want to automate on. You can create groups on top of that. Typically, 99% of our customers, that's not really sufficient. The inventory comes from third-party sources like your OpenStack environment, your VMware environment, your public cloud environment, or even a custom database. We have the ability to integrate and invoke third-party devices and clouds and assets to build and complete the inventory for you to be able to automate on top of that. So, does that make sense? Any questions? Is that all clear to everybody? Am I talking too fast? Are you guys getting this? Awesome, very good. I got a couple of nods, so that's good enough for me to continue. We talked about Ansible, what it is, the modules, and what it can do. The power of Ansible really comes into the extendability of what you can do with it within your organization. I want to be able to, as a developer or as an operations person, or even as a third party like the likes of the SIs and the managed services that you invoke today, that they are building, managing, and configuring my environment the same way across the whole stack. I want you to now think as a customer, when you go out with an RFP to your vendors and say, I want you to provide service X, Y, or Z, is that they want to be able to build it in the same consistent way that you are automating on top of your existing assets and your existing environment, that when you bring in something new, it fits in within the processes that you've already built in within your organization. That's a very powerful statement in terms of consistency, security, compliance, and the way that automation runs across your whole organization. This is an important factor when you start thinking about operations teams and infrastructure that's not really static, that's constantly changing. The only thing that you can standardize across that is how the environment looks and how it's run. So I promised you we're going to give you an example of what a playbook looks like. We have a playbook here. This is an example of you building an Apache server and pushing some configuration files and starting some services. I have another example at the end as well that shows you how to automate on top of Windows, which looks exactly the same. But let's just second for you guys to have a look at it and understand what it is, and we just go through it. It's as simple as this. This is actually how a playbook is run. It's human-readable language. You can understand everything that's on the screen. What I'm doing, I have a name for the playbook, install and start Apache, and I'm running 3 different tasks. I'm defining the hosts, and the host is basically the end inventory that I'm running this on. This could be a static inventory, could be a dynamic inventory, could be 1 host, could be 1,000 hosts, could be 2,000 hosts if you want. Defining some parameters, how do I want this? Do I want to run this as root, or do I want to run this as a standard user? And putting some variables on top of that. I'm defining that my HTTP proxy is running on port 80. Very, very simple. And then this is the important bit. We talked about modules. Yum is a module, copy is a module, and service is a module. This is how you invoke modules within Ansible. It's as simple as this. If I'm doing this on top of a window, on top of a networking device, instead of Yum, I'm using iOS config. Instead of Yum, I'm using WinRM to actually push this level of configuration. So that gives you that ability to easily pick up automation and build on top of it. What this playbook is doing in the first task, it's that using Yum to install HTTPD. After that, it's copying some files, your HTML file, and restarting the service to make sure that it is up and running. The fact that it is sequential gives you the ability to ensure that every single step and every single task is done sequentially, that you can stop at any point in time and you can also roll back. So let's say, for example, we push in task 1, which install HTTPD, and that fails for whatever reason. The playbook is no longer going to continue on that specific device. It's going to give you an error message that you understand that there's something happening wrong there, but it will continue the automation across the 999 other devices that you want to automate on top of. So that gives you the ability to understand that the task will only continue once it's been done properly and to completion across your whole environment. Ansible is what we've seen so far. This is the open source community, the command line based tool, where you've got a RHEL machine or an Ubuntu machine or even a Mac that you're actually running this whole automation on. That's not really sufficient for you to be able to automate across the whole enterprise. You want to take this beautiful automation and this beautiful language that we've built in and extend it to the whole enterprise. How do we do that? This is where Ansible Tower comes in. Ansible Tower takes the Ansible core and wraps an enterprise framework that gives you a few functionalities on top of that. A very rich UI and a RESTful API that works northbound and southbound, can be invoked by third-party tools, and it has the ability to interrogate third-party APIs. It comes with fully based, role-based access, integration with SAML, LDAP, whatever directory that you're using for authentication, and you have the concept of roles. Now you have people that are developing automation, people that are consumers of automation, and people that are viewers of automation. We have built in the concept of a workflow, where I'm taking this playbook that we've seen earlier and stringing 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of them together in a row that builds in your application stack. A playbook can be deploy my server, another playbook is deploy my application, a third playbook is adding additional configuration on top. We wanted to make it enterprise ready, so we've built in scaling and high availability as part of that. And we've built in an external Postgres database where we're encrypting all the credentials and all the data that you want to extend across the environment. And we understand as well, like I said, we don't work in isolation. There's a lot of stuff out there. We want to be able to push these logs and these audits in terms of what we're doing from a compliance perspective into your Splunk or Sumo Logic or even locally within the Ansible Tower. So it gives you that level of compliance and comfort that any automation job, you can actually trace what happened. I can be using one pseudo credential to automate across my whole environment. With role-based access on top of Ansible Tower, I can easily correlate who's the user that ran my automation job at what time, and I can easily reverse non-authorized changes as well. So what does that give us? At the bottom here, the blue 3 screens that we talked about before, simple, powerful, and agentless. We have built in control, knowledge, and delegation. By control, I mean you actually have role-based access and you have full control in terms of how automation is run within your organization. It's not just the DevOps developer that's running Ansible Tower today, it's your infrastructure team, it's your network team, and they have the right credentials and the right level of access to be able to automate within their sphere of influence. Knowledge, another very important thing. I want to be able to see my inventory. I want to be able to see when my automation ran, what broke, what changed. Was that unauthorized change? All these level of information is available from the UI. Delegation. We have service desks and operations people that are doing repetitive tasks day in and day out. You've built in this fantastic automation that fixes some kind of issue within the organization. You want to be able to give that to somebody who's non-technical that can run a lot of fixes within your organization without any technical knowledge. You give somebody a username and password where he can run some automation that fixes that specific issue. That's a very, very powerful way with utilizing automation within your organization. So, working well with others, Ansible Tower integration. In the middle there, you can see the Ansible Tower estate, 3 Ansible Tower nodes that are logging into a centralized database where all your credentials are kept and all your logs are kept. But we understand as well that a lot of, who uses Jenkins today? Any hands for Jenkins? Excellent. Artifactory? Awesome. There you go. So these people have built in some level of automation, some pipeline management in terms of how they actually deploy services today. Don't rip and replace. Put Ansible on top of what you've done on top of Jenkins and Artifactory to complete the story for you. This is where we come in. We fill in the gaps. And we can push this level of automation across whatever environment that you see, whether this is VMware, AWS, domain controllers, networks, custom databases, etc. So this is just something to keep in mind when we start talking about Ansible is, don't think, oh, I'm using Puppet and I'm using it for my infrastructure today. I can't actually have another automation toolset. That's not how we see it. We see it as if you see a gap within your organization in terms of how automation is done or some manual tasks that you guys need to automate, have a look into Ansible Tower. It could be a perfect fit for your organization, how it runs. So some of the feature sets of Ansible Tower. Automation doesn't have to be run by somebody sitting in front of the machine clicking deploy, deploy, deploy. If we've tested our automation, we make sure that it works. We can deploy these things on a scheduled basis. If we have an organization that deploys the changes only after hours, there's no need for somebody to be sitting there in front of the machine seeing what's going on. Let's schedule these jobs and get people time with their family, I think. Tracking the inventory. We wanted to be able to visualize the inventory for you. We wanted to be able to consolidate the inventory for you. Let's say you're running some RHEL estate on top of AWS, Azure, and your VMware and Hyper-V, and you want to be able to push some security patches across all of them at the same time. You can do that from Tower. You can do a smart inventory where you're gathering data from multiple different dynamic inventories, and you're defining that this is a Red Hat inventory that I want to push some Red Hat patches on top of that, and then you can push automation on top of that. Same applies whether it's Windows, whether it's network devices, whatever it is that the end device that you want to build on top of. So this is a very powerful way of dissecting your information and your inventory and your organization into how processes run. Self-service IT, we talked about this. This is giving somebody who's non-technical the ability to go and deploy things. It could be technical or non-technical. It gives the ability for you to take all this automation tool set that you've done and expose it to the different sides of the business to let them choose. If it's a dev and test environment, give them the ability to create a username and password for them to be able to log on to the service, so you don't actually have to interact with these things. Reduce your time for deploying a lot of these services today. We talked earlier about this, about workflows. This is an example of how we build a workflow. Job one that can fork into 2 jobs, into multiple jobs, that has an end-to-end visibility in terms of how your organization is structured and how your infrastructure is structured. I want to be able to ensure that in a success of one task, I'm invoking an additional task and a third task and a fourth task. So we've been seeing a lot of huge benefit in doing this. And let me give you a small example about this. I know I've mentioned it before, but again, it's important to mention it. Let's say the network team and the DevOps team and the infrastructure team are working together. They've built in this fantastic automation. You now have this repeatable modules that you can reuse and over again without understanding what the network team does. I'm a DevOps guy. I have a security policy that I need to apply from a networking perspective, and I have a security policy that I need to apply from an infrastructure perspective. These have been defined by these other teams. Let's string them together and becomes the basis of how I deploy application. So as a developer in day 2, once I've deployed my application, I'm deploying on top of a virtual machine that's secure, that's compliant, that's already approved by the infrastructure team and the security teams. This gives you the ability to take automation a lot further in your organization, how it runs. I was asked earlier, somebody from MBN who wanted to see a customer success story. I wasn't going to show this, but I've been advised that I have a few more minutes. Can we roll out the Splunk video about our customer success story, please? So it's just a minute. It's not long, but it just puts it in a way where you understand how Ansible can change organizations.
My name is Mike Regan, Cloud Operations Engineer at Splunk. Ansible has definitely helped Splunk basically automate all of the tasks that a human would have to do before. And for things that we don't know how to do, we can have one person figure out how to do it, create the playbook, and now everyone knows how to do it, because all they have to do is run that playbook. It distills that knowledge that one person had to struggle to gather, and then all they have to do is put it in the playbook, and now it's shared with the rest of the team. We started to use Tower basically things that we don't want to tie up in the ops engineer's workstation with. So maybe active backups or collecting small facts, stuff like that. And now we're trying to actually get it to do auto scanning for us, to do the callbacks, to basically apply the stack role to all of our instances. We basically deploy a Splunk cluster into the cloud. And then on top of that, we will install apps. We will make changes to the cluster configuration through Ansible. Every change we do in cloud gets deployed through Ansible now. I think. Except for maybe the first time. The first time we have to figure out how to do it manually, and then we'll make the playbook to do it.
I like the last bit where he says, like, except for the first time. And that's absolutely true. When we talk about automation, there is a part where you have to test things, right? And there's always going to be that initial phase where, how do I do this? The beautiful thing about Ansible is that it's so simple that once you actually figured out how to do it in a manual way, it's so easy to automate that. And this is testament with Splunk, where they do a lot more complicated things than what I can do personally. So automation, we talked about this in the beginning in terms of the what, the why. This is really the how. This is how you can accelerate your organization adopting new technologies, reducing the operational effort that you're doing, and having a platform where you can really build a lot of these capabilities on it today. Whether you're looking at this from an infrastructure perspective, a DevOps perspective, or a networking perspective, Ansible has a story that can help you fit and automate and accelerate a lot of the technologies that you are deploying today. We're almost done, so don't fall asleep yet. There's just a couple more slides before we go. Just quickly, because to give you an idea in terms of the effort that we're doing around the network automation, we're supporting over 25 network platforms. We have over 250 networking modules. We have a dedicated practice within Ansible that has a product manager, has a a development team that's purely focused on the network side of things. And as I mentioned, if you're talking about SDN, if you're talking about innovation within your network, come and talk to Red Hat, because we have a very compelling story in terms of how we can transform networks. It's always been the last thing that people think about automating. We want to bring that into the forefront. Fantastic stuff they're doing in DevOps perspective. Let's bring in the network guys into the same discussion in terms of how they can be agile, how they can deploy, and how they can do this in a lot faster way. Our story with Microsoft continues. Our love for Windows continues. I don't know if people are really happy about hearing that in a Red Hat Forum conference, but we have 70 plus modules, and we have over 350 PowerShell DSC resources. It's a very, very compelling story. We've been actually engaging with Microsoft a lot in joint opportunities in terms of how we can enable customers to move into Azure, how they can use automation to help them build from left and right. I know some people are shaking their heads about the Windows story, but it is the future. We see ourselves as an end-to-end automation platform. That's it from me. Before I go, I just wanted to kind of go through the same slide that everybody's been through before, but I just want you to go to this URL at the end, ansible.com/tower trial. You can download a 10-node Tower license, go ahead, play with it, see how easy it is to implement it, how easy it is to start automating. And if you find it awesome and you want to hear more, come and talk to me or Richard over there. We can schedule some demos for you. And if you really want to see how this can transform your enterprise, by all means, schedule an Ansible discovery session. So thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate your listening.